Hi guys, Thom Hunt here in the kit room, and today's subject is going to be the costs and benefits and differences between exposed hook setups and offset or Texas style setups. Okay, so just to explain before we start, here is a good example. I've got the hypo tease on a jig head, and that is what I'd call an exposed hook setup, where the hook point is obviously exposed. And then I've got a Shad tease slim here on a Texas style setup, which is weedless or offset hook. Now, the first point I'd like to make is whenever possible, I'm always going to put an exposed hook setup on. The hook point is exposed, so nothing has to happen before there's an opportunity for that hook point to catch hold in the fish's mouth. Whereas with a Texas style hook, obviously the fish has to come along, they have to move the lure out of the way before the hook point is exposed and then before it can go in. So you should technically, and you do, always have a slightly better hookup ratio with an exposed hook. However, there's obviously times that you need to use a weedless presentation, particularly rivers. They're very snaggy, rocks, boulders, timber, they're very wild waterways, and they typically have a lot more snags in. So my go-to will be something like this. So I've got a cheb weight on the front there that I can obviously swap out anything from 1.5 gram up to 20 gram, or even times in flooded rivers, I've had them where I've had 15 gram. I link them all together, so I've got 2 or 3 of them on there to create a really heavy weight and an offset hook. But there are a few tips that I need to pass over. So the first one is going to be, you have to be really, really aware of what style lure you're going to fish on them. Because you've got to get the balance right between the size of the hook and it not looking too unnatural. But you've also got to get a big enough hook on there that leaves enough gap down at the bottom for the lure to physically move out of the way to expose the hook point. So this is the Shad tease slim, and that's a really, really good example of one that I would use. One that I wouldn't typically use straight away, let me find one for you, here we go, is the regular Shad tease. You can probably see there has a much, much deeper body in the belly in this section. So if I rigged that, they're both roughly the same size lure, something that I'd use for sort of perch fishing. But if I rigged that up, I think you can probably see there will be hardly any gap at the bottom here for that to actually move out of the way before the hook point's exposed. So if I did use that style lure, I would actually rig it sideways at 90 degrees. I'd put it on so it would be on the hook like that. Okay, it gives a really interesting presentation when you do that. It tends to flutter and flop around a lot because the weight of the hook wants to pull it like that. But when you pull it, so it will sit like that as it's going down and flutter around. And as you pull it up, the lure wants to turn up like this for the paddle to swim. And so it sort of goes like that and then turns on its side, goes up. So it's a really interesting presentation. But the main reason that I put it on is because you can probably see there, if I put it on sideways, there's going to be plenty of room for that lure to be able to get out of the way to expose that hook point. So be really, really careful about what types of lure that you put on. Also, depending on the rubber, there will be at times, once you put a fresh lure on, I actually make sure I sort of put it through so it's the right distance, and I think, that's rigged up quite nicely there. So it's not stretched, it's not bunched up. I will then actually take the hook out, and if it's got a barb on it, I'll sort of try and rip out a little bit of that hole, and I'll put the hook back in right next to it. So effectively I'm creating a slightly bigger hole that hook is coming through. And what that does is it just makes it, if you just rig it up fresh and you put it through first time, the rubber can actually grip onto the lure quite more strongly than you would imagine. But if you put that hook point through 2 or 3 times in sort of roughly the same area, it just creates a slightly bigger gap, and it allows that hook to move and slide down on that lure and just move out of the way to expose that hook point. Now, let's run through a slightly different rig. Here's a Carolina rig. Okay, so we've got the hook, the weight, the bead, the swivel onto my hook length. And the reason that I'll use an offset hook here is a couple of reasons. First one is that tend to be fishing with a Carolina rig very, very close to the bottom anyway. Jibbing it along, really keeping it in that bottom sort of 18 inches or so. But the second reason is when you've got no weight on the rig, an offset hook, because you can see the metal at the bottom here, it makes the lure fish in an upright position, okay? And it rights itself, so you can pull it up. This weight will always want to come down first, so it keeps that lure in a really nice, stable, upright position. So it doesn't tend to spin around. Some of the other style hooks, so I'll come on to that in a minute, but that will always be my starting point. However, if you do find yourself having 2 or 3 bites that you've missed, or you've had 1 or 2 fish that you've hooked, small bites, hooked them, maybe a couple of head shakes and then they've come off, you've got to be aware that they're obviously not being aggressive enough to really expose that hook point for you to get a proper hook hold. So as soon as that's happened a couple of times, cut that off and put yourself on something like this, all right? So I will downsize the lure and I will upsize sort of the ratio of the hook to the lure. Now that looks like a very big hook for that style lure, but when you're getting those very finicky bites, you've got to have a really nice wide gape exposed hook, and that small lure should get sucked in a bit easier, and it's got a really, really nice exposed hook point there. However, these do kind of flop around a little bit as well, which I'm not super keen on compared to how these stay nice and upright with Texas hook on. But it's something that you've just got to play around with and just try and get the best ratio you can for the day. Now, there is one scenario that I will never, ever use an exposed, a weedless style Texas setup, and that is pike fishing. Pike have a very long bill, and so if you imagine a perch's mouth is kind of like this, yeah? If you imagine a zander's mouth has a little bit of a bill on it, and then a pike's mouth has a long bill, the ability for a pike to clamp down on a Texas rig like that and then let go without the hook point ever being exposed or ever being anywhere near getting a hook hold is high. You will only really get somewhere about 1 in 3 pike out on a hook of this sort of style. So I always, if I'm specifically pike fishing, I'm always fishing a large exposed hook. And you can see there as well, that is absolutely perfect. I really want a nice big gape. I don't want a tiny hook on here. I want a nice big gape that I can get my finger under, and it will expose that hook perfectly to be able to get a catch somewhere in that pike's mouth. Now I do have a couple of different rigs here. For a normal setup, if the pike are feeding, so you've probably seen some underwater videos where they're, on a water wall, for example, they swim along like this and the pike comes up and engulfs the lure. When they're doing that, I'll fish that setup because the stinger, they're coming from behind, and even if they come up a little bit short on it, they're going to be catching on the rear stinger. However, sometimes, especially in the summer or in the spring, if they're being very territorial, they'll come up and they'll T-bone a lure. And it almost, and they take it like that, and it almost works in the same way as that sort of Texas style hook, where they clamp down on it and then just let go again. And if they do that on this style rig, and the hook points are over here, they'll then just let go and no chance. So I do tend to fish it with the stinger rigged in the belly, or certainly towards the front third or front half of the lure. So if they attack the head or they T-bone it, then you're gonna try and get some sort of, you can see that catching into my hand, you're gonna get some sort of hookup rig. The Westin HD jig heads that these ones are, they also have, don't know if you can see that there, they've got a little loop on the underside, so it makes it absolutely perfect for this type of rig. So yeah, I mean, that's actually a pretty good tip as well. If you are perch or chub fishing on a river in the summer, for example, and you specifically don't want to catch pike, consider using this style hookup because it has such a poor ratio with pike. Okay, that's actually one way to try and avoid them. But as you can see here, even a smaller setup, this is an absolutely brilliant little jig head, which is stand up. So I'll fish this hopped along the bottom, but it's a finer gauge wire and a slightly less wide gap. And you can see I've selected the right type of lure to still give me that gap at the bottom. So this is the Westin kick tease. Nice and slim, absolutely perfect on those smaller style. You've got the Westin Shad tease slim, or if you're going to go for a regular shad tease, turn it 90 degrees. Or absolute favourite for Carolina fishing, because you can put the insert in which counteracts it. So it's got a little foam insert which counteracts the buoyancy of the hook. When I'm fishing Carolina rig, it's always the hollow tease because it squashes down to expose that hook nicely as well. So there's some good lure recommendations there. A few tips on species, certain scenarios to use them. And hope you're staying safe at home, guys. And right, that's the end for this one. I'll see you on the next one.